Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights.
Most important thing to emphasize is Canadians should not be traveling to Lebanon. We've had that travel advisory up for many weeks now, and any Canadians there in Lebanon should be coming home. We see that the risk of escalation is real. The challenges in the region are significant. We are making certain preparations to be able to support in the event that everything gets much, much worse. But the situation is so difficult that we may not be able to get all Canadians out. That's why while the airports are still open, while there is an opportunity, we're encouraging and asking all Canadians to please leave Lebanon while there are commercial routes available.
Why are we bringing in cheap foreign workers to undercut young Canadians just so that massive corporations like Tim Hortons can save a few bucks an hour? And what would a Conservative government do to reverse this trend?
Our temporary foreign worker program should only be available to fill jobs that employers have proven beyond a doubt cannot be filled by Canadians. It should never be used to bring in low-wage workers from poor countries to take jobs away from or suppress the wages of Canadian workers. I challenge Canadian business to hire Canadian workers first, and I challenge the government to end the chaos in the temporary foreign worker program.
Okay, so we heard a half-hearted warning about Canadians traveling to Lebanon from Justin Trudeau, and of course Mr. Poilievre still pushing his opinions about the foreign workers policy. And we also heard a little criticism about the coffee donut giant Tim Hortons. While we know that it is true that Tim Hortons has an ongoing program that actually brings people into the country as foreign workers who are actually seeking long-term citizenship, not just to go back and forth. That we know that Tim Hortons does have a program that actually brings people in from other countries so that they can work in their shops and service coffee and donuts at all of the Tim Hortons locations. Is it something that is really taking away from Canadians, or is it showing how Canada is trying to help our world just be a better place? So that's a questionable thing when we talk to Mr. Poilievre about that. And those short recordings are actually from off of YouTube via the Toronto Sun. So moving on to CNN, and we're seeing a heat up on X, formerly known as Twitter, with Elon Musk and Donald Trump of course, Elon Musk trying to boost the Trump presidential campaign, where, of course, Mr. Trump was originally banned from Twitter until Elon Musk took up, basically bought out Twitter and took in charge and gave Donald Trump back his Twitter accounts. But the really happy news that I found on Twitter was that there was a piece on Twitter talking about how Kamala Harris is overtaking the polls. And, of course, that is something that the Trump camp doesn't really want people knowing. They want you to think that the Kamala campaign is fizzling when it is actually growing stronger in the polls, and that the same thing historically happened with Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump eventually won. So everybody who is actually a Kamala fan, please, we have to keep pushing for her to win. We can't stop until we actually cross the finish line and see her taking the presidential oath on Inauguration Day. So let's keep pushing there. All right, and that is about the. There's also from CNN. There's a heat up of tropical storm Ernesto has formed on the Atlantic and is racing towards the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, with heavy rainfall, gusty winds, dangerous seas. As predicted, a hyperactive hurricane season ramps up. So, as we know, of course, Florida has been hit once or twice already. And moving on with earthquakes. Where do we have an earthquake? L.A. experienced an earthquake in the middle of the night on Monday, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. The earthquake wasn't really for the West Coast Pacific. 4.4. Oh, well, we can live with that one. Pardon the sarcasm. We've had bigger earthquakes though in our general area. As it says, reported by CNN, a magnitude of 4.4 earthquake occurred in Los Angeles on Monday at 12:20 Pacific time, according to U.S. Geological Study. The earthquake startled residents and rattled schools, interrupted several live and recorded shows. Monday's shaking prompted the LA Fire Department to go into earthquake mode with crews at 106 fire stations doing surveys on their districts. So they are actually taking action. 4.4 could be leading to something more serious. And moving to Ukraine with Russian President Vladimir Putin to kick the enemy out of his country's territories after it emerged Ukrainian troops were in control of dozens of Russian villages a week into Kiev's surprise cross-border incursion. On Monday, the Ukrainian military chief said some 386 square miles of Russian territory were now under Ukrainian control. Imagine Mr. Putin isn't too happy about that. So, let's move on to today's segments, and we're going to hear from the head of the Afghanistan efforts for the UN, as she's talking about gender roles in Afghanistan and how they are pushing forward. We are going to hear from, in Canada, we're going to hear from a new Canadian party, the Canadian Future Party, as they launched, and they're going to answer some questions about what it is that they stand for and what it is that they're trying to accomplish with a new party. In why they formed the party also. So we're going to hear about that as they appeared in Ottawa. And we're also going to hear from the UN Security Council with a short segment on Gaza and the desperate tries at reaching a ceasefire for that region. 3, 2, 1. The head of the UN country office in Afghanistan, Alison Davidian, told reporters in New York City 3 years ago a woman in Afghanistan could technically decide to run for president. Now she may not even be able to decide to go out and buy groceries. The briefing remodeling Kabul to discuss women Afghan country profile. Davidson, today no woman in Afghanistan has leadership positions anywhere that influence politics, either at national or provincial level. When women are engaged in the Taliban structures, they're either roles are largely to monitor compliance of other women with discriminatory decrees and political and this political insurance is really mirrored in this at a social level. The UN women official said the Taliban restrictions on women and girls will affect generations to come. She said the gender's country profile shows that by 2026 the impact of leading 1.1 million girls out of school and 100,000 women out of university coordinates to increase of in early childbearing and 45% and increase in maternal mortality up to 50%. Davidson said the world is watching what happens to Afghan women and girls, and in some cases it watches to condemn, but others it watches to emulate the Taliban system of oppression. We cannot leave Afghan women to fight alone. If we do, we will have no moral ground to fight for women's rights anywhere else. So why don't we listen to the segment as Alison Davidian discusses what is happening to Afghan women and women's rights and how this could affect women's rights around the world.
And with that, let me turn to our guest, Alison Davidian. Please put her up on the screen. Hi, Alison. Welcome. It's great to see you. So we have as our guest today Alison Davidian, the UN Women's Head of the Afghanistan Country Office, to discuss the gender country profile for 2024 for Afghanistan. Ms. Davidian, the floor is yours.
I've just come back from the north of Afghanistan, and I asked the women that I met with, what would you like the world to know about your lives now? And one of the women I met with, Nasima, told me this. I was married at 16. I couldn't finish school. My hope was that my daughter's life would be better than mine. Now I'm worried that her life is going to be worse. For those who are still listening, please help us fight for our freedom. This week marks 3 years since the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. 3 years worth of countless decrees, directives and statements targeting women and girls, stripping them of their fundamental rights and eviscerating their autonomy. Our latest publication, which we're launching today, shows trends based on rounds of consultations that we've done with Afghan women, thousands of Afghan women across the country, from provincial capitals to the most rural areas, since August 2021. And the first most striking trend is the erasure of Afghan women from public life. To date, no woman in Afghanistan has a leadership position anywhere that has influence politically, either at national or provincial level. When women are engaged in the Taliban's structures, their roles are largely to monitor compliance of other women with their discriminatory decrees. And this political erasure is really mirrored at social level. What our data shows is when you take away fundamental rights, it impacts across all areas of life. Of the women that we've surveyed, 98% said that they had limited or zero influence over decision-making at the community level in their communities. And it's also reflected in the home. Our data shows that the percentage of women who feel like they have influence over decision-making at the household level has dropped almost 60 percentage points over the past year. And just to give some context, 3 years ago, a woman in Afghanistan could technically decide to run for president. Now, she may not even be able to decide when to go and buy groceries. Now, I'm not saying that 3 years ago it was perfect. It was not perfect. But it wasn't this. Linked to the loss of rights, our data also points to an escalating mental health crisis. 68% of the women we surveyed said they had bad or very bad mental health. And 8% of women said that they knew at least one other woman or girl who had attempted suicide. What's clear 3 years in is that the Taliban's restrictions on women and girls will affect generations to come. Our analysis shows that by 2026, the impact of leaving 1.1 million girls out of school and 100,000 women out of university correlates to an increase in early childbearing by 45% and an increase in maternal mortality by up to 50%. So, in the face of this deepening women's rights crisis, I'm often asked, what can we do? What can we do to support women and girls in Afghanistan? And my answer is always this one key thing. We must continue to invest in Afghan women and girls. Nothing undermines the Taliban's vision for society more than empowering the very part of the population that it seeks to oppress. Practically, based on UN Women's work over the past 3 years, investing in women means three main strategies. The first is to allocate long-term sustainable funding to women's organisations. This is one of the most effective ways that we can reach and access women and girls, respond to their needs, and also invest in one of the few sectors left where women can influence decision-making. It's hard, but it's possible. Secondly, is to design programs that directly counter the erasure of women and girls, investing in their resilience, their empowerment, and their leadership. So initiatives, especially like education, livelihoods, entrepreneurship, these are crucial ways to address the structural drivers of gender inequality. And finally, we need to create spaces and facilitate spaces where Afghan women can tell us directly on what their priorities are and what their recommendations are. Our data shows that Afghan women want to represent themselves. But one meeting, one participation option is not enough. In every and any form of engagement, we need to be asking, how do we meaningfully include Afghan women? And how do we break the patterns of women's exclusion? 3 years ago, the world was watching a takeover that was live streaming horror after horror. And 3 years later, while the world's attention may have turned elsewhere, the horrors have not stopped for Afghan women and girls, but nor has their conviction to stand against oppression. When it comes to the women's rights situation and the fight for women's rights in Afghanistan, we are at a real inflection point, but not just in Afghanistan, globally as well. The world is watching what happens to Afghan women and girls, and in some cases it watches to condemn, but in others it watches to emulate the Taliban's systematic oppression. We cannot leave Afghan women to fight alone. If we do, we have no moral ground to fight for women's rights anywhere else. Their fate determines the fate of women everywhere. And what we do, or what we fail to do, for Nasima, for her daughter, for all Afghan women and girls, is the ultimate test of who we are as a global community and what we stand for.
Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to turn the floor over to the press for questions. Yes, Maggie.
Hi, Alison. Thank you for the briefing. It's Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. I was just surprised a bit, I guess, at the statistic you mentioned about women losing their input in decision-making within the home. I can understand in the community, perhaps, but at home, what's your interpretation of this? Were men just grudgingly giving their wives and daughters more input before and now they don't have to? Or, how do you see this? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Look, I think when you take away women's right to education and restrict their rights to work and public life, it affects all rights and affects women's agency more generally. And that's reflected in the real decrease in women's decision-making. And as these restrictions go on, the influence over decision-making, both at community, and household level has decreased.
Okay. Yes, Jennifer Peltz.
Hi, Jennifer Peltz from the Associated Press. Turning to your call to invest in education, entrepreneurship, and so on for women, how is it possible to do so under the conditions you describe? How can you foster entrepreneurship among people who aren't even allowed to take their own initiative to go to the grocery store?
So women are able to run businesses in particular sectors, except not beauty salons, but they are running mainly home-based businesses in tailoring, carpet weaving, food processing. But there's two main challenges that they face. First is access to markets, especially around mobility restrictions, because of the mobility restrictions. And the second is access to finance, access to formal banks. So there's a lot that UN Women and we as a system are doing to support women in terms of accessing markets, accessing capital, and supporting business development skills, so that in the space that they have, they're able to utilize it as much as possible. So there is a real focus right now and on women businesses as an entry point.
Okay, and online we have a question from Yvonne Murray.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. My name is Yvonne Murray. I'm with RTE News. Did you ask the women that you spoke to in Afghanistan about the Doha meetings organised by the United Nations? And if so, what was their view of these meetings? And specifically, what did they think about women's rights not being on the main agenda and women's groups being excluded from the main meetings? Thank you.
So we know that one meeting and one participation option is never going to be enough to address the severity of the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan. Last year, we know that the Security Council adopted a resolution, 2721, that clearly called for women's participation. And this should be the text that we really anchor strategies to increase women's participation across a multitude of avenues, both direct and indirect. And we also need to make sure that these long-term strategies are accompanied by also programs to support women's leadership and resilience at the country level. In everything we do, in every format, we need to be asking, how do we engage Afghan women? How do we integrate women's rights across all of the topics that we're discussing? How do we break the patterns of exclusion? When we speak to Afghan women say we want to represent ourselves. And we need to be ensuring that that happens across all of the forums, multitude of forums possible.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm from NHK Japan. So I heard some madrasa, the religious school in Afghanistan, is start accepting, some girls for the secular education. How do you evaluate the roles of those madrasa? And do you have concern maybe Taliban might start restricting those education in madrasa?
So I travel across Afghanistan regularly, and the topic that continues to come up time and time again by women everywhere I go, from the provincial capitals to the most rural areas, is this collective mourning, truly, over the inability of girls to be able to go to school and to be able to graduate and go to university. There's no other country in the world that bans girls from going to school as a matter of policy. And so the impact that this also has, not just on education, but on the economy, is very clear. We have data that says that by 2066, if these bans were to continue, the Afghanistan would lose $9.6 billion in GDP. That's 2/3 of its GDP as it currently stands. So we're seeing how the overall bans on girls' access to education affect the health of the economy. And women want girls to be able to go to school. Adjusted education, what we hear from Afghan women is that it should not be a replacement for that.
Abdul Hamid, online.
Thank you, Alison. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Alison, I have a personal question. I hope you understand my background. I served in Afghanistan too, but for a brief time. How do you connect with the women? Do you sit with them? Do you talk to them? Do they open up for you? Do you speak their language, or how do you evaluate your personal relation with Afghan women? I have an experience when women start talking, they started crying, and they affected me as well. So how do you evaluate your personal experience?
Yeah, thank you for your question. The best part of my job is that I'm able to go and meet with Afghan women across the country and listen to them and hear what their priorities are. All of our programming, everything we do at UN Women is anchored on their voices and their priorities. And what Afghan women want is what any woman wants, which is the ability to live a life of her own choosing. And that's a real basic commonality that we all have in common. So in that sense, it's the greatest privilege of my life to be able to go and meet with Afghan women and hear from them directly, and to use every platform I have to elevate those voices and priorities.
Thank you.
Margaret Bashir again.
Thanks, Alison. It's Margaret again. Just one more question. The results of your survey really were pretty grim, and I'm just wondering then, has advocacy, international pressure, frozen assets, has any of this had any success whatsoever in easing the plight of Afghan women?
So, despite all of the challenges, Afghan women are still finding ways to run women's organizations, run businesses, deliver services to other women, protest online. And I think what's really critical is that that we continue to have global solidarity and commitment and action behind them. Afghanistan is not the only country in the world where women's rights are being rolled back. But it's true that the speed and the scale of the rollback in Afghanistan is a warning to women, everywhere, of how fragile gains are on gender equality and how quickly that can be taken away. So we need to continue. It's a long game. We need to continue to invest in women and girls, put our political will and our funding behind them, and continue to have global advocacy to effect change in their lives.
Okay, so in Ottawa, interim leader Dominic Carty holds a news conference to mark the official launch of the Canadian Future Party. He is joined by interim party president Tara McPhail. The Canadian Future Party will field a candidate in the LaSalle, Amman, Verdun, and Elmwood Transcona federal by-elections in September. All right, so why don't we hear what they had to say in Ottawa for the new party, Canada's Canadian Future Party.
one of the politically homeless Canadians who turned to the Canadian Future Party because I did not see myself reflected in any of the existing political parties. J'ai été impliqué dans la politique pendant la majeure partie de ma vie. Entre mes études du premier cycle et mon diplôme en droit, j'ai travaillé comme collaboratrice sur la colline du Parlement. J'ai été fortement impliquée dans la dernière course à la direction du Parti conservateur et j'ai été membre ou supportrice à long terme des partis progressistes conservateurs et conservateurs. Until a few months ago, I was president of my riding's conservative electoral district. But I became disenchanted with the options I saw. We have a fiscally incompetent government and an opposition who responds to that with policies by rhyme and a boatload of snark. Meanwhile, our countries and its citizens suffer from various crises. Affordability in general, cost and availability of housing in particular, healthcare, a sputtering economy, climate change, and a loss of influence and prestige amongst our allies in the democratic world. Je ne veux pas et je ne suis pas intéressé par des mesures pour résoudre ces problèmes existentiels qui sont motivés par le puritanisme idéologique, que ce soit à gauche ou à droite. Je veux un parti politique qui les abordera avec des solutions basées sur des preuves, le bon sens et un jugement éclairé. I want a political party that will implement policies because they are effective, not because they will slice and dice the population into tiny wedges to gain some kind of electoral advantage. And I want to see that communicated by leaders in a respectful and civil tone that reflects the seriousness of what it is we do when we assume roles in public service. Ce qui est perdu aujourd'hui dans le service public, c'est qu'il est là pour servir les Canadiens. Pas le parti politique avec lequel vous êtes aligné et pour lequel vous feriez un virage à 180 degrés si cela pouvait vous donner un léger avantage sur vos adversaires. I was born in Whitehorse, grew up in Vancouver, Regina, and Edmonton, and have studied or worked in Kingston, Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. I presently live in Vancouver. I am privileged to have lived in so many diverse and beautiful regions of our country, and my sole aim is to ensure the greatness of Canada going forward. I'll now turn it over to our interim leader, Dominic.
Thank you so much, Tara. Thanks to the press gallery for hosting us this morning. Pascal, thanks for helping with moderation. And thank you for being part of the launch of Canada's newest political party. And so I think the first and most obvious question is, why on earth do we need a new political party in Canada? Short answer, Canadians have been asking for this. They've said that they want a government that is fiscally responsible, socially liberal, that spends carefully, but recognizes that the role of government is not to control citizens, but to make it easier for all of us to live the lives that we want. So until today, no party is offering that combination. We do. The Canadian Future Party is for all Canadians, and I promise that we are going to be courageous, we are going to be competent, and we are going to be evidence-based. Ce parti a été créé parce que les Canadiens l'ont demandé. Les Canadiens et Canadiennes disent vouloir un gouvernement qui soit à la fois fiscalement responsable et socialement libéral, qui dépense avec prudence et reconnaît que le rôle du gouvernement n'est pas de contrôler les citoyens, mais de faciliter la vie de chacun pour que nous puissions vivre comme nous le souhaitons. Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, aucun parti n'a fait cette combinaison. Nous le faisons. Le Parti Avenir canadien est pour tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes. Nous serons courageux, nous serons compétents et fondés sur des preuves. So why courage? Because our country today in 2024 is facing challenges more serious than at any time since the Second World War. Our current leaders are bluntly misleading Canadians about the severity of multiple crises in front of us. In the face of social media division, economic uncertainty, and hostile foreign states seeking to undermine our democracy, the need for clarity and the need for courage has never been greater. Courage means being honest about what government cannot do, and courage means being honest about what government must do. Courage means looking at government programs, recognizing their flaws, and offering honest solutions to fix them. And that's where competence comes in. It's not enough for a politician to say something must be done. There must be a plan to turn announcements into results. Without a plan to make democracy deliver, the best ideas won't just fail, they'll end up by undermining faith in democracy. This party is led by citizens acutely aware of the limits of both the public and private sector, by the need for balance, and most of all, by the need for government to deliver for its citizens. And that's where evidence-based politics comes in. We're going to approach every problem by looking at evidence. That's our ideology. By looking at facts, by sharing our research, our methodology, so Canadians can understand how we arrive at our policy conclusions. For example, that means no time wasted arguing about climate change. It's real. What matters is how we unleash our creative forces to fix it. Mais les faits ne suffisent pas. Si nous avons appris quelque chose de la dérive vers un gouvernement basé sur le populisme ou les relations publiques, c'est que les valeurs comptent. Dans un ensemble clair de valeurs, tout dirigeant, tout parti, tout pays peut être poussé ici et là par les marées de l'opinion publique, par les efforts pour influencer l'opinion. So I want to be clear about our values, because I think that's a conversation that's too often escaped from our discourse in recent years. We believe Canada's history, including its darkest chapters, have provided today's generations of Canadians with the wisdom that we need to continue to improve our country. All countries have those dark chapters. What matters is the work that Canada and Canadians do today to shine light into those dark spaces, and just as important, to make sure that we shine that light forward to navigate the dark paths ahead. Nos valeurs sont claires. Nous croyons que l'histoire du Canada, y compris ses chapitres les plus sombres, a fourni à la génération actuelle de Canadiennes et Canadiens la sagesse nécessaire pour continuer à améliorer notre pays. Tous les pays ont ces chapitres sombres. Ce qui compte, c'est le travail que le Canada accomplit aujourd'hui pour éclairer ces espaces obscurs. C'est pourquoi le Parti Avenir canadien est résolument inspiré par le passé de notre pays, avec tous ses défauts, et enthousiaste pour notre avenir. L'arc de l'histoire humaine nous mène vers plus de liberté, une plus grande richesse et une plus grande égalité d'opportunités pour tous nos citoyens. So we're arguing that for too long, Canadians have been asked to play a political shell game. Under the shell, on the left, the social programs you need. But along with it, too often, you have to buy bloated government, ever-increasing spending, divorced from delivering results. Under the shell on the right, we're supposed to find fiscal discipline. But along with it, too often, there's a mean-spirited approach that blames the most vulnerable for their plight, selfishness masquerading as liberty that happily misdirects government resources to the wealthy and polices our bodies and our bedrooms. The Canadian Future Party proposes to move not left, not right, but forward. The sterile argument about whether the government should intervene in all sectors of the economy or in none is over. We have over 100 years of hard evidence that shows a mixed economy in an open and caring society is what works. Le gouvernement n'a pas à surveiller les comportements privés qui n'affectent pas les autres. Les tribunaux existent pour protéger ces droits et doivent être utilisés. Les questions politiques concernant ces droits sont réglées et toute tentative de les utiliser à des fins politiques par une quelconque partie devrait être condamnée. So, what are we offering? We're starting off by campaigning on 5 broad planks. A discussion on Canadian values and better governance. We commit to democracy and open society, to defined individual rights and collective responsibilities. One concrete example. We will adopt the British system that we already copied most of our political system from to force party leaders to earn their caucus's support for every vote, not just for budget and confidence motions. The dictatorship of party leaders is a choice made by Canadian party leaders. It's up to us to end it, and the Canadian Future Party wants to play its part. 2, we want to make democracy deliver. by reforming government programs, opening up competition wherever possible, while guaranteeing universal public accessibility. We want to see the Hillier Plan for Housing implemented to help solve our housing crisis, combining the energy of the public and private sector to build houses now. Number 3, to increase Canada's defence spending to 2% of GDP, defending democracy abroad means strengthening it here at home. And part of that is a plan for a universal citizens' resiliency corps to support community vibrancy and disaster relief efforts across Canada, giving our young people skills, building our national identity, and allowing our armed forces to focus on national defence and global security. 4, to restore faith in an immigration system that was for a long time the pride of the world and has been opened up to incredible attacks and damage by this Liberal government. We need a plan to fix the temporary and student immigration system. When Mr. Poilievre talks about the need to eliminate gatekeepers, our current immigration crisis shows what happens when we allow that to happen. The Liberal government eliminated the gatekeepers, took political action to overturn standards that had protected our immigration system, and that's why we have an immigration and housing crisis today. We need better gatekeepers, not to get rid of them. Number 5, to make life more affordable and increase incomes by dismantling the protectionism that sees our political parties cozy up with big business, big labor, and foreign dictatorships to fix prices that benefit them and hurt the middle and working class. We're going to open our telecommunications, airlines, and agricultural sectors to competition. So, in short, that's what the Canadian Future Party is all about. Courage, results, and evidence. Most importantly, this party is about you, Canadians. Are you fed up with extremism? Fed up with promises that cost you money but don't deliver results? Join us and help us build this movement. Joindre à nous, aidez-nous à créer ce mouvement pour changer la politique dans notre pays. Alors, on dit aujourd'hui, en avant, not left, not right, but forward. Thanks very much for listening and look forward to taking questions.
Great, thank you. Now we'll turn to questions from the room. And I will start with in the back, Ian. Just before, at the beginning of the question, please state your name and affiliation. And go ahead, Ian.
Ian Bailey, Globe and Mail. I've seen reports that you'll be running candidates in the 2 pending by-elections, the Salamard, Verdun, and Elmwood, Transcona. But how many candidates are you hoping to run in the next federal election, which is obviously looming in the many months ahead?
Thank you. We intend on running as many candidates as we can in accordance with our strict nomination and vetting procedures.
And let me fill in on that. Our nomination procedures are going to make sure that as much as possible the Canadian Future Party is protected from foreign interference. Only Canadian citizens will be allowed to vote in our nomination contests, and we will be doing everything we can and have already been working hard with security experts, IT experts, to make sure that our party is as free from interference by foreign actors as is possible.
Could you elaborate on that? Like, what's your concern? And also, if you're not running, shall we say, the full deck of candidates, I mean, what kind of limitations will that place on you? How will that affect your goals?
So I don't, again, as President McPhail said, we are expecting to run as many candidates as we can based on our strict nomination criteria. One of the things I want this party to be is a no-nonsense party. We're not going to give you spin and rubbish about saying, oh, we're going to do this and that and the other thing. We're a new party launching today. We've got massive interest from across the country. We had 2 candidates lined up for the by-elections that have already been called before they were called, and we expect that enthusiasm to continue. But whether this party grows or not depends on the work that Ms. McPhail and I do, the rest of our team does across the country. But in the end, it's up to Canadians to decide whether they want to see the Canadian Future Party be an option for Canada's future. If they do, we're here.
All right. Go ahead.
Adam Harris with the New Brunswick Telegraph-Journal. Dominic, I guess obviously you're not going to parachute into the 2 by-elections, but do you plan to run in Fredericton? What's your plan as interim leader in terms of how long you'll have that role, and then for the federal election?
So we'll be having a convention in November and be deciding on how the party is structured going into the campaign expected for next year. And in terms of where I'll be running, I absolutely expect to run. It would be odd to be leader of a party and not to run for it. And making the decision on where exactly over the coming months in consultation with the team. Obviously, I continue to represent the Fredericton constituency in the provincial legislature, and that job finishes up next month or the month after, depending on the decision of Premier Higgs, and we'll be making a decision on that some point after that.
A follow-up, I mean, you've done this to a degree before. You took the New Democrats in New Brunswick from a distant fifth party to something respectable. I wanted your take on how that is similar or different from what you're doing here. And then also your strategy there was to run a provincial campaign, and it's often been criticized if maybe you would have focused on one or two ridings, you could have got yourself into the legislature and made a bigger difference. Do you take that lesson there and apply it here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I would be a pretty bad candidate for any office if I didn't learn from experience and learn from mistakes. And certainly the experience from my time in New Brunswick, you said, helping to build a political party up really from nothing. There are some areas in which that's the same as this current project with the Canadian Future Party. Some areas where it's different. One of the great things about starting a new party is that we can be very clear about our principles, and we don't have the baggage that some of the old parties have. That if someone comes up to us and says, I'd like to join your party, but I don't think climate change is real, we can say, Mr. Poilievre is looking to talk to you. That's just fine. We welcome your engagement, but not in our party. If you say you don't support a woman's right to choose, again, there are other options for you out there, not the Canadian Future Party. If you say that you don't believe in resolving land claims within 10 years to actually stop talking about First Nations issues and apologizing to First Nations people and actually dealing with those problems, we're here to say that's what we're offering. If you don't like that, find another home. So we're going to be pretty strict about what we talk about and our expectations, not just for us as the leadership of the party, but also for our members, that we are not interested in continuing the foolish culture wars that have ripped our national politics apart and ripped politics across the Western world apart, and we're not going to play that game. So there's a huge advantage in having a new party where we can be very clear about what we believe in from the start and make it clear what we believe in, and that if folks have contrary ideas, they have other homes that they can look for. Welcome their engagement, but not with us.
Will you focus on a few ridings and not 300 plus?
I think that'll be a question which I'm absolutely going to listen to the leadership of the Canadian Future Party. I think you're quite right that my insistence on running a full provincial campaign back in 2014 cost me a seat in the legislature, and I don't think that was the right decision. So one of the other things you're going to hear from me is when I make mistakes, and Adam, we've worked together for a long time, you know that I just come out and say, I made a mistake. I'm going to keep doing that.
Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, Lisa Mayer, CBC News. You said you've got candidates lined up in those two by-elections that are just over a month away, a couple days off of a month away. When will you be announcing who those are, or can you announce them today?
Mark Curry is already our candidate on the ballot for the Montreal by-election, and Mark's a fantastic guy, and we'll be sending out some communications about him and having the kickoff for our first ever campaign as the Canadian Future Party tomorrow afternoon in Montreal. I hope folks come and join us. And for the Winnipeg campaign, we have just getting our candidate on the ballot there, and we'll have news there in the next couple of days.
And my follow-up question, the Conservatives are leading quite steadily in the polls and have been for a while. What makes you think this is something Canadians want?
The polls are very clear about it. They're tired of Mr. Trudeau. They want an alternative. But there's also a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the extremism and divisiveness that has approached Mr. Poilievre's approach to politics since he became leader of his party. And we aim to offer an alternative to that. I was shocked the other week that Mr. Poilievre, the leader of a conservative party, came out and said he refused to promise to increase defense spending to 2%. He is riding on the coattails of the American MAGA movement, and that sort of politics is not Canadian. Equally, when the Liberals talk about how everything is just fine and sunny ways, they're living in the 1990s. We have got to have a realistic 2024 approach to politics based on Canadian needs. So I think that Canadians are looking for a positive alternative. Whether they like what we have to offer, we'll find out in the weeks and months to come, and that's up to Canadians to decide.
If I can add to that, it's clear when Canadians are surveyed that about 70% of them say they don't have a political home. They don't like the options on the left or the right. And we've moved away from a policy and tone of moderation and keen judgment and civility. And when I speak with Canadians, they say they'd like to see more of that. So we do think that we are helping to fill a vacuum that exists.
All right. I don't see any questions online at the moment. Please use the raise hand function if you have a question. Actually, I do have a question now from Félix Arsenault, Radio-Canada. Go ahead, Félix.
Canada à Moncton. Ma question serait pour M. Cardy. Adam a un peu abordé en anglais. On connaît votre parcours provincial, chef du NPD, ministre chez les progressistes conservateurs indépendants maintenant. Comment est-ce que vous vous retrouvez dans ce parti-ci, dans sa direction qu'elle prend, et comment votre parcours chez l'NPD et les progressistes conservateurs influencent les politiques de ce parti?
Merci pour la question, Félix. J'espère que j'ai appris les leçons de toutes mes expériences en politique. Avec le NPD, c'était clair qu'au Nouveau-Brunswick, c'était un petit parti, c'était difficile d'attirer l'attention, et en particulier quand il y a les militants dans le parti qui sont plus extrémistes, qui étaient toujours en train de dire « ce n'est pas notre tâche de gagner les sièges ». En comparaison avec les conservateurs, il y a trop de gens qui disent « on va faire tout qu'on peut pour gagner les sièges » avec aucune référence à nos valeurs, à nos principes. Pour moi, les deux sont inacceptables. Moi, j'ai maintenu les mêmes principes depuis le temps que j'ai commencé en politique, les décennies passées maintenant. Je suis toujours quelqu'un qui essaie de faire les décisions basées sur l'évidence. J'essaie d'être honnête avec les gens. Encore, comme j'ai mentionné Adam quelques minutes passées, j'essaie de donner mes excuses si je fais les fautes. Pour moi, ça c'est la manière appropriée de gérer un parti et d'être honnête dans une démocratie. Les chefs ne sont pas les rois, ne sont pas les dictateurs, ils sont les chefs des partis démocratiques dans une démocratie. On a besoin d'engager les citoyens et citoyennes pour épanouir notre démocratie. Alors, encore, je n'ai jamais changé mes principes, j'ai changé le parti parce que les partis ont changé. Le parti conservateur d'aujourd'hui de M. Poilievre, c'est clair que ce n'était pas le parti de Joe Clark, mais pas le parti de M. Harper. Le parti libéral de M. Trudeau, ce n'est absolument pas le parti de le père de M. Trudeau. Alors, les partis sont toujours en train de changer. Pour moi, les principes ne changent pas. Et les principes, pour moi, le courage, l'évidence et le gros bon sens.
Une question suivie, Félix?
Oui, pour revenir vers les élections partielles, c'est quoi un peu l'objectif dans ces élections partielles-là qui sont dans un mois? Et aussi pour les prochaines élections, est-ce que vous pensez réaliser une percée? Est-ce que c'est ça le vote?
Je m'excuse, Félix, on vous entend pas très bien. Est-ce que vous pouvez vous approcher du micro et parler un petit peu plus fort?
Oui, donc je voulais savoir, c'est quoi un peu l'objectif pour les élections partielles qui arrivent dans un mois, mais aussi pour les prochaines élections qui sont dans un peu plus d'un an. Est-ce que vous pensez réaliser une percée? Est-ce qu'on veut aller chercher un siège?
C'est toujours le but. Si on présente les candidates, c'est de gagner les sièges. C'est la décision des citoyens. Citoyennes de Montréal, de Winnipeg, pour les élections partielles. Et en vue de ça, on attend le jugement de la population. Et c'est tout qu'on peut dire sur ça. Encore de notre parti, tu vas pas entendre la rhétorique pour dire « oh, on va faire ici et ça ». On ne connaît pas. M. Poilievre ne connaît pas les résultats de la prochaine élection, ni M. Trudeau. Un mois, 6 semaines passées, M. Trump pensait qu'il va être le président encore aux États-Unis. Les choses peuvent changer rapidement. Alors, on va attendre le jugement de la population canadienne. On va préparer, faire tout qu'on peut pour être une option viable.
Okay, merci. We will go back to the room. Ian, you had another question?
Yes. To Ms. McPhail first. What kind of you mentioned you were a conservative. I think you were head of an EDA. Could you say where that was? And also, what kind of reaction have you had from conservatives and such, given this step you've taken?
Yes, I live in Vancouver, and so the EDA was in Vancouver. Vancouver Kingsway. And the reaction is what you would expect, unhappiness. And a view that I've deserted the party. My response is the party deserted me. The Conservative Party today is not the Conservative Party of Brian Mulroney. It is not a centrist party. It is not moderate in terms of policy or tone. And we know that Canadians tend to hug the centre. They are looking for good judgment, civility, and moderate, rational policies. And to be frank, I think those are missing in today's Conservative Party, and so that is what I say to my Conservative friends.
Mr. McCarthy, you're the interim leader. Will you be the leader going into the next election? Are you able to say, what's the process going to be?
We'll be having a convention coming up in November, and so right now we have an interim leadership structure with myself as leader, Ms. McPhail as president. We have a national council, which includes former NDP MP, and we have people from different parties who are participating in the leadership role, and those will all be confirmed or changed in a fairly normal convention in the fall. The process has to be adjusted somewhat because of the short timelines between our approval by Elections Canada, which took considerably longer than we had expected. So we have, again, some very strict rules around our nomination procedures, so we have to amend those for our first convention simply because of timelines. But certainly my hope is to be able to lead this party into the next election, but it's up to the folks involved in the party to make that decision.
A question for both of you. What's your sense of how you've been received in Quebec? Obviously in a key electoral battleground going into the next election. What's the sense of interest you've had from that?
I think the sense of interest is strong. I think Quebecers, like other Canadians, are unhappy with the options before them and are delighted and enthusiastic about the prospect of another alternative. I would like to add to the answer I gave to your question a moment ago about response from Conservatives. I should also say that there are many Conservatives who are unhappy with the leadership style and the policies espoused by Mr. Poilievre and are delighted that they may have another option to look to.
We have another question from Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one. What does success look like? A registered party gets 50% of their spend back if they get 2% nationally, 5% in the ridings they run. Is that the bar, or what is a success in your mind?
Success is changing Canada. I'm serious. You know me long enough, Adam, to know I mean that. I don't care about parties. I care about the country. Parties are a vehicle to make change. And we're going to offer a program that's going to have some fairly new ideas, different from the other parties, to change the country. And if we're able to meet that, that's fantastic. If the other parties take our policies, that's great too. We're here to try and make as loud a noise as we can about sane, evidence-based decisions. And the more that we can obviously reach those technical thresholds for getting money back in elections, yay. But if we do that and don't change anything, then we failed. So the goal is to change the way that Canada works. Because right now there's lots of things in Canada that aren't working properly. Canada isn't broken, but it needs an upgrade.
You mentioned the convention coming up in November. Do you have registered party members right now? And if so, how many?
We just became an official party, so Elections Canada has a very arcane system for becoming registered. I don't have our current membership numbers. I know they've gone up a lot since last night when the news about today's launch happened. But we have had 250 founding members were required to submit to Elections Canada before we could even become a registered party. I don't know, Tara, if you wanted to fill in on that.
No, I think you've covered it quite well. Thank you.
And a follow-up, what is your plan for funding?
to go and talk to as many Canadians as possible about how they should chip in the price of a couple of beer, the price of a meal out, something that they think is worth sacrificing to help a party offer a new alternative to Canadians. So one of the things I'm pleased in Canada is we don't have big money dominating Canadian politics. We have strict limits on spending. So we're going to go out and try and use that system to raise as much money as we can to get our message out.
The polls, you're no doubt aware of public opinion polling, suggests the federal Conservatives have a massive lead over their rivals, the other parties. Obviously, the voters haven't gone to the polls yet, but in the election's a ways off. What kind of challenge do you think that polling research presents to you? What's your sense of it? Is the game over before it begins?
Well, obviously, we don't think the game's over, otherwise we wouldn't be here kicking it off. And we don't think that it's over because when you look at those same polls, you see a lot of Canadians who say that today they're parking their vote with Mr. Poilievre, saying they're not particularly comfortable with him. They've got concerns about his tone and his attitude and his approach. They've got concerns about someone who out-campaigned Max Bernier's crazy fringe party to the right, saying in the Winnipeg by-election that the World Economic Forum owned Mr. Bernier. One of the most appalling things I've seen in Canadian politics. Just foolish. So, again, we're going to be a no-nonsense party that I think is going to put some clear ideas out there, and it's going to challenge the Liberals and the Conservatives to come back with sensible policies of their own, because I think that's what Canadians want. So our hope is that we can take advantage of this moment when it's clear Canadians do want a change, but they are not particularly comfortable with Mr. Poilievre, that we'll offer them something new, different, and positive. And we're going to get to work on that starting today.
Lisa, go ahead.
Have you heard from any current MPs who've expressed interest in your party?
Had conversations with a number of MPs. I think there's a lot of folks involved in all parties and none who see the dysfunction in our political system right now. And certainly my experience, 4 years as a cabinet minister in New Brunswick, has made me even more acutely aware of how we need change in our politics. So we have got folks around our leadership table who, again, have backgrounds in all of the major political parties at different levels, including former MPs. And in terms of current MPs, I would guess that a lot of them will be looking to see how we do the next little while. And I hope that we can attract some of them, because there are some great MPs from all parties. And wouldn't it be nice if we could actually start saying that again? That they're not terrible, they're not awful human beings. That there are some fantastic people involved in politics in the different political parties in Canada right now. And we hope that people who are attracted by the values that we're putting on the table right now, regardless of their history, will give us a look. And we'll continue those conversations. And again, if they just take our ideas and not our party card, I'm fine with that too.
Okay, I do not see any further questions, so this concludes our press conference for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Pascal, and to the press gallery, and for folks who turned up. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
On y va.
Final thoughts. We need to, as the human race needs to rethink how we're doing things, and we need to come to the realization of we don't need to fight over lumps of land, that we need our politicians to think about the working people, the people that actually pay the taxes, make the country run. They clean the streets. They do the office work. They're the simple people who every now and again get the right to cast a vote. They're not the big corporate leaders. They're the ones who work for the big corporate leaders. And the government is supposed to represent us, the simple people, the ones who pay the bills for the country, and less representation for the corporations. You probably find a lot of that is the reason why a new party formed in Canada, and a lot of reason for a lot of uprisings in other countries around the world, because people are tired of the big corporations scooping up all the money and leaving very little left for those who actually do the work. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media. You've been listening to Policy and Rights here. And I've been your host, Michael Clogs. Please find the subscribe button wherever it may be and give us some support so we can keep spreading the love around the world.
I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, once again, the Council is coming together to discuss alarming developments and increasing tensions in the Middle East. The devastating Israeli attack on the Al-Tiban school in Gaza City, which prompted this meeting, points once again to the desperate need to reach a ceasefire, free the hostages, and scale up humanitarian aid to Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces airstrike in the Al-Tiban school compound took place early on 10 August. It killed dozens of Palestinians and wounded many others, including women and children, according to local Palestinian sources. The Secretary General condemned the continued loss of life in Gaza following another attack on a school sheltering hundreds of displaced Palestinian families. According to Israel, the IDF targeted a Hamas command center and a mosque inside the school compound and killed at least 31 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters. As the Secretary General underlined yesterday, international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack, must be upheld at all times. Also yesterday, Hamas announced the killing of a hostage and serious injury of two others by Hamas militants while in captivity in Gaza. Both sides have stated they are looking into the incidents. Mr. President, with hostilities continuing across the Strip, including in the north around Gaza City, in the middle area in Khan Yunis, and in and around Rafah, the situation remains catastrophic for civilians. No place is safe in Gaza, yet civilians continue to be ordered to evacuate to ever-shrinking areas. My colleague, Director Outen, from OCHA will brief you shortly in more detail regarding the dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza. 10 months since the start of the war, the threat of further regional escalation is more palpable and chilling than ever. Exchanges of fire across the Blue Line have continued nearly daily. Since I last briefed on 31 July, numerous projectiles have been fired from Lebanon across the Blue Line, causing damage to buildings and bushfires in open areas. The IDF has responded with strikes across the Blue Line into southern Lebanon. Uncrewed aerial vehicles crossing the Blue Line from southern Lebanon have also continued. An IDF base was hit across the Blue Line, while another base was hit near Nahariya in northern Israel. An open area in Nahariya city was also struck. Mr. President, I urge continued attention to the worsening situation and ongoing violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. On 3 August, the IDF said it conducted 2 airstrikes on a Hamas cell in Tulkarem, killing 9 Palestinians who the IDF said were planning to conduct an attack inside Israel. Separate IDF operations in Jenin and Tubas early last week also killed another 16 Palestinians. On 11 August, a shooting attack claimed by Hamas killed 1 Israeli civilian and wounded another in the northern Jordan Valley in the occupied West Bank. Another Palestinian shooting attack, Nel Kalkilia, reportedly injured 1 Israeli and 2 Palestinians. The assailant, who was claimed by Hamas as an Al-Qassam Brigade's commander, was subsequently killed by ISF. Mr. President, if the slide towards an even greater catastrophe is to be halted, the parties must end all escalatory rhetoric and actions. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for all to work vigorously towards regional de-escalation in the interest of long-term peace and stability. I welcome efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to bring both sides to conclude a deal to bring about a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and desperately needed humanitarian relief. As the leaders of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States emphasized in their joint statement on 8 August, and I quote, "There is no further time to waste, nor excuses from any party for further delay," end quote. Their call for immediate relief to the people of Gaza and the hostages and their families must be heeded. I urge all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and promptly conclude this deal as endorsed by the Security Council in Resolution 2735. The United Nations is committed to supporting all efforts towards this goal and remains in close contact with the relevant parties. Mr. President, the killing, destruction, and suffering in Gaza must end. The hostages must be reunited with their families. But even as efforts to achieve these goals continue, we cannot lose sight of what we consider indisputable. In the absence of a clear path towards a future in which Israelis see their legitimate needs for security materialize, and Palestinians see their legitimate aspirations for a fully independent, viable, and sovereign state realized, lasting peace in the Middle East will remain elusive. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Dottin.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.